if I work on a religious tradition, especially where these things come up, it's Judaism, and those two are interestingly set apart in important ways. But I was going to say that another contrast that comes up a lot, at least in the literature I read, is between, say, tradition and reason. This is true a lot in moral philosophy and other kinds of considerations. And in those contexts, then tradition is almost by definition here something that's not fully rational. So to go back to your original question, why does it have the place in our lives that it does? One answer you might think is because we are not always fully rational in how we do things.
Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm your host, Yannick, and now joining me, Saul Goldberg. Saul Goldberg is a professor at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Saul Goldberg, to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Yannick. It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's start. So who is, first and foremost, Saul Goldberg in one sentence?
I have different answers for this. Usually my answer is, I'm a boy from Thornhill who made it out. But I don't know that that's the answer you're looking for in this context.
That's great, actually. No, I love that.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more. So what brought you to U of T and especially studying religion?
So my position, I should say, when I first came to U of T, my position is also in the Center for Jewish Studies, the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. But when I first came to U of T, I was in the philosophy department. I switched a couple of years into the religion department, where I teach mostly philosophy of religion courses.
It's such a fascinating topic. I think it's really like where humanity basically meets. So philosophy and religion is really what we somehow need in order to make sense and meaning out of our lives, right? And so what was it particularly that you made interested and ultimately pursue a career in academia?
I don't know. I think I also, again, have different answers to that question. Some of it is about delaying growing up. You know, when you're a graduate student, you see it takes a long time to finish graduate school. You have other friends who've gone on to law school and have careers and jobs and money and things like that, and you're still living as you were when you met them. So maybe there's something appealing about not growing up too quickly for me. I didn't have the gray beard back then, so it certainly wore better. But I think probably for a lot of people who become academics, there are just certain questions you want to ask. And you don't really have the same levels of discussions, I think. You don't get to have as many discussions as you'd like in the university, but it's rare to have them sort of outside the university. So, I've been very fortunate to really throughout my adult life to have enough people around where I can have really good, interesting conversations, both about the things that interest me and the things that interest them, and that I learn a ton from the people I work with, and I've collaborated with, or the people you sort of meet in all sorts of professional settings. There's just so much to know that's worth knowing. I think that's the part that I still like best, are just those conversations, that there are people thinking hard about important questions. So yeah, that's my favorite part.
And it also keeps you young. It really feels like you look very young, especially in your spirit. I think.
In the spirit, in the beard. Again, I think I could look old.
But also looking, of course, but especially also in the spirit. I can really feel that, and that's so beautiful. I think it really keeps you young. It keeps you somehow connected. but it's also a lot of work, of course, and sometimes you also can cut up. I think usually that is what I kind of observe is when you think a lot as you do, you are much more likely actually to hit the wall in the sense of getting, mental health issues, for example, because you're all the time in your health. So did you ever had challenges with mental health? Because that's real.
I mean, I suppose it depends what you mean by challenges. I don't want to minimize like what I think would be really challenges where there are difficulties and things that people really struggle and need all kinds of support, a variety of types. But I would say I'm lucky in that sense. But there are those days where one struggles to find the work that you do fully satisfying, or other things about the way the world is that can be upsetting, or how you look at your life. I mean, I feel really blessed in my life, so that's why I would not say that I have really those kinds of challenges. But I'm prone to sort of dwelling on things that don't go well, or if I teach a course or something, or a class that isn't as successful as I like, I can I can be a little upset. But I don't think these are the kinds of challenges that I don't know. It seems to be that's probably not what you're asking about. I get down, but I don't think I have those kinds of challenges.
No, it makes sense, but you're also very smart because you just told me that you want to help, cooking. I guess your wife, and so I think you also have a very good balanced life, and that's crucial. To be engaged, you have connections, and that really keeps you healthy too. That's very important.
Yeah, well, my
But this
wife is
was a little
great,
bit
so
on
I
a
like doing
tangent,
stuff for her. Yeah.
so let's go a little bit more into the specifics, in terms of tradition, because you are actually a lot about traditions. And so let's start with what tradition is, and then how does it somehow shape our identities and life.
It's very generous of you to say that I know a lot. I've thought a bit about tradition. I think there are people who probably know more. Uh, Tradition is it's hard to pin down what it is. From the most part. So I'll say a couple things. One is, firstly, the kind of philosophy I like makes a bunch of distinctions. And then, so the question is usually you want to figure out what you have as a sort of concept of tradition. And if you, which is, I think what you wrote me about originally, I didn't know what way you'd want to pursue it. But then you want to sort out what the concept is. Usually you want to distinguish that from, say, neighboring concepts in different ways. So we have different sorts of pairs that sometimes come into play when we think about tradition. One idea is that that's maybe distinct from something like custom. And you'll see the word custom get used in different ways. Sometimes they mean the same thing. Sometimes they're different. Sometimes custom is, say, more local, what you do in your house and what I do in my house, as opposed to tradition, which are tied more to, say, things like religions or larger structures. Sometimes traditions are more explicit versions. One other way of distinguishing tradition and customs is that traditions are explicitly formulated, whereas customs are just the ways of doing things that we have that we don't really reflect on. It's just the way it's done here, but not. It doesn't have the authority that usually the concept of tradition is thought to have. And then you can go into further things about what is tradition, what's custom. If I work on a religious tradition, especially where these things come up, it's Judaism, and those two are interestingly set apart in important ways. But I was going to say that another contrast that comes up a lot, at least in the literature I read, is between, say, tradition and reason. This is true a lot in moral philosophy and other kinds of considerations. And in those contexts, then tradition is almost by definition here something that's not fully rational. So to go back to your original question, why does it have the place in our lives that it does? One answer you might think is because we are not always fully rational in how we do things. The interesting thing about traditions is they make a claim on us for allegiance, for certain kinds of behaviors, and the like, that if they were fully rational, then we would do them because they're rational, and the need to make the claim on behalf of tradition would be unnecessary. So in some ways, it can seem that things that we do out of tradition might be problematic, precisely because we can't give some other sort of accounting of why we do it. So it's an interesting problem that comes up, especially when you think about these things philosophically. I think there are good reasons to follow traditions and what roles they play. But in terms of your original question, I think one of the things I would say is that you, at least to make it a bit problematic philosophically, is that you could say, well, the reason people follow traditions is because they're being something other than fully rational.
But it's also very interesting, actually, because when you look at traditions, let's say in your field, in Jewish culture, Judaism, more specifically, for example, like the idea of, one God, let's say. And so would you say that this faith in believing or having a certain tradition to believe in God, how does it differentiate from a philosophical concept, for example? How does it differ?
So what you would call, say, the traditional religious conception of God as opposed to the philosophical conception? Yeah, I'm not, so though I do philosophy, I'm not super sympathetic to some of the philosophical articulations of God. I just think they don't have a lot of traction for most religious people. And there's also not one. The classic one is what's known as like the God of the sort of omni attributes, right? The way philosophers will describe this are the God who is omniscient or all-knowing, omnipotent or all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, right? So all good. And this is thought to be, if you want the object of supreme worship, then having something that's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good seems a good way to get, as a rational construction, a good idea. The traditional idea, maybe this fits with what I was saying before, is quite different. And in Judaism, it's often pointed out before, even God announces, let's say at Mount Sinai or something, I'm the Lord your God, it's first, and what happens is sort of the references to bringing them out of Egypt and other things. There's a lot that goes into like a personal relationship where I am tied to you and you are tied to me. And then, God's attributes seem not, in the philosophical way, not so important in that context. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a profound difference when you think about this being that you are closely related to in a psychological, emotional, theological, historical way. And then this entity that's relatively abstract and a pure concept of reason or something. They're quite different kinds of things, and you would relate to them very differently. And the debates historically, mostly in the Middle Ages, would be about worshiping the right kind of God and why you would prefer to worship one kind of God or another.
So then would you say that, if I understand this correctly, then tradition is basically more something that is tangible, that we do consciously or unconsciously, that really makes up like a culture, that makes it somehow work, and that in one way or another points to whatever deity you believe in?
Yeah, it's interesting how specific it ever gets in the pointing. Like, it's not clear that you get a fully worked out characterization in the way language, especially the way philosophers think about language, it fully points in that way. But it does tie you to a certain kind of being and the stories that you tell, and those things will make up precisely the relationship to to this being, to God or something. Um,
How do we interpret or reinterpret or adapt traditional practices, let's say in Jewish culture,
yeah.
to fit into our current lives? How do we usually do it? What is the process? Can we somehow pin it down, or is it?
So I don't think there's. So it's a great question. The subtle kind of academic answer is that there's more than one process that goes on. It's worth saying that we live in a world with many different denominations of Judaism, and you can partly say maybe it would be true for all of them in some way that it would be impossible to think of a Jewish identity that isn't tied to a past and to something like a tradition. But it's the interesting thing when you sort of ask the question, as you have, about how is it that we keep traditions relevant to today. Some people today, some Jews of today, will do this explicitly. That is, they may modify tradition in some way. So, for example, say the Sabbath, and how the Sabbath, what it is to celebrate the Sabbath would be a good case where for some people it will have all the resonances of the imitation of God and the works of creation and a day of rest or something. But you can see that now, well, it's not about that. It's about something else. We don't think about God and creation and this. You can give it a sort of Marxist reading if that's a way of keeping it current for you, but you'd have to be a Marxist maybe for that, or certain have a socialist outlook. Maybe you have an idea about, well, what the day really can signify for me or my family is precisely spending time together as a family or enjoying things in some other way. So you might not keep all the laws of the Sabbath, but you might still have some way of connecting it to today. I think others, it should be clear, are not interested in doing what you suggested. So though they maybe have to some way fit into the world, part of their way of doing this is by denying that they're doing anything different. This is some of the features of what's known as ultra-Orthodoxy, that they are opposed to ideas of change precisely because they don't want to associate with features of modernity that put pressures on us to keep our traditions up to date. And it's a really great question and I don't want to go on for too long about it, but there's a lot to say about the whole history of this from the very beginnings of the moments of revelation of the Torah, the basic laws of Judaism, and how those get reinterpreted. Is sometimes also put. This is another contrast I didn't mention before, but in Judaism, there's a lot of work done about the relationship between tradition and revelation. Revelation is this major foundational moment, but that moment recedes into the past, and its status is maintained through a tradition. And especially the way the rabbis work and other things, it's a really interesting question about what's known as the dialectic between revelation and tradition in Jewish life for many years.
Yeah, it's so interesting because as the Rabbi Sachs, I think, once said, secularization really started with Abraham, when he went up to the mountain, and that is, I find, also a very interesting and powerful interpretation, somehow to connect it to modernity and actually give it somehow even basically the backbone of modern science.
So wait, the idea there was that when Moses comes down from Sinai with the tablets, that's secularization? Is that the idea?
Yeah, or more, I think more specifically to that, there is only one God. And by the time, it really started, there was somehow this logos also, which came into play. And so this is how I, understood, how he
I
interpreted,
see.
but obviously he has a much more, and um, specific explanation to it. But I think everything, obviously, in the West, we stand on this very blueprint, whether it comes to the laws or to the way we still do things. Our whole institution is all based on this very, you know, Jewish worldview. How we see the world. With Moses. Who became like with the Ten Commandments, right? And so I find it very, very powerful how everything played out, and we somehow, of course, in hindsight, it's always easy also to ultimately connect the dots, right, and make sense of it, right? That's also a way we make meaning, right? Because we seek and we make meaning everything, every moment, right? And so therefore, of course, we have to be careful there too. But I think it's just so rich, and all these traditions, whether you want to call it, religion or worldviews. Of course, there are differences too between a religion and a worldview in the sense of an ideology, right? I mean, I can make up my proper ideology, but a religion is usually rooted in history, right? And no one would deny, today that it, to some extent, things played out as they they were written down in the Torah, in the big scheme, I would say. Um, so what roles do rituals play? Whether it's like a ritual, let's say when Connor McDavid like goes, and plays his game, he always does the same thing, right? And so tradition somehow is also informed by rituals. So what role do rituals play according to you?
In tradition or
Yeah.
something? It's a good question. Probably, I have colleagues who I'm almost embarrassed to answer the question because I think they think more about ritual than I do and have more to say. Uh, I also think there are probably different kinds of rituals. Say so some right. There's a difference between say again celebrating the Sabbath or something, which is a weekly ritual or something, which is different than say life cycle rituals. Um, uh, which births, coming of age, death, marriage, these kinds of things are very different because they're usually sort of one-offs in the life of a person. So they may have uh, different functions. In one way, though, maybe the general feature that they share is again, they're ways of connecting us to a community, to that community's say sacred object or something, to its values. But you can also think of them depending on the specific case of doing other things. So the Sabbath is again as a way of marking you. It's not only like bringing you closer to God in some sort of imitation of God and God's activities, but also connecting you to other people who are doing the same ritual at the same time in an important way. There's something else, though, about just even marking in your own week. So dividing up days in certain ways or the week into significant portions of time. I think all of these fall under what you were describing before as ways of making meaning. I think that's a good general phrase for it. And then it's important to think that there are a variety of ways in which we make meaning or we make different sorts of meanings for different reasons. The sort of habitual or common rituals, the repetitive ones, as opposed to the one-offs, really would be quite different. That you would say want to imagine a wedding ceremony as being something that in normal life, once upon a time, in a certain society, people would have gone through once. and it would mark, or certainly coming of age. You only are bar or bat mitzvah once in your life. You don't come of age multiple times. So these are important precisely because they happen once, and the relationship to the community is that change of status. That's different than a repetitive one, morning prayers, evening prayers, things of that sort.
What role do you give tradition in general when it comes to the success in terms of the society we have built, in terms of advancement of technology and institutions? What is really like, how much can we credit all this success to traditions, whatever you want to define it?
Yeah, that I don't have a good. I wish I had a good answer for you, Yannick. I think one of the things about the kinds of things that you're pointing to with technologies in life, that'd be another. So obviously another contrast. You can go through all of the concepts that you'd want to contrast, but there's a contrast between also tradition and modernity. So the story of modernity is a story about sort of a break from tradition. There are other ones. Again, you can go through other important concepts that are often historically have been contrasted with tradition. So tradition in nature is an important one, but tradition modernity is a super important one for your question. And one of the things actually that what happens with modernity in a variety of spheres of life is that it's actually wipes out tradition. So this is famously the case, say, in arguments about the French Revolution and criticisms, famously Edmund Burke's criticism or French traditionalists' criticism of the revolution was that it was precisely wiped away a whole history of arrangements of a society, and it left people untethered. Supposedly, it was to create a more rational, just, liberal society, but it had the effect for some of seemingly wiping it away. This is true also. So it's not my area, but I have colleagues and friends who do Eastern European history or Russian history, and so stories about what happened in the Soviet Revolution was in many ways with urbanization and modernization of the society very rapidly. It was seen as really wiping out a very traditional form of life, led to all types of animosities and hostilities in different ways, that to try to remake people who had one view of the world to now live according to a different set of values, different sorts of practices, different ways of making goods, of purchasing goods, of relating to human beings. It's profoundly transformative, and tradition is in many ways what's being destroyed, at least in their experience, across the board. So.
Yeah, and I mean, we have seen what this actually can inflict on a society with, the revolution. Yeah, in Russia, I mean, it was terrible. What makes you feel alive?
What makes me feel alive? I think you mean this in a spiritual way. I kind of want to give the non-spiritual answer and say
Absolutely, it doesn't. It doesn't.
things like
It doesn't
breathing,
mean.
stuff like that makes me feel like I'm alive. Conscious thoughts make me sort of. I mean, I don't know if they make me feel alive. They make me aware that I am alive. I don't know if things. I don't think I ever. Hope this is not a disappointing answer, but I don't think I ever used for myself the phrase of feeling alive. I I take it for granted that like when I'm breathing and I have conscious thoughts that I'm alive and in many cases awake. Um, uh, so I think of it that way. The question of like if sometimes feeling alive is a synonym for feeling happy, then I'm pretty happy generally seeing my daughter, seeing my wife, seeing just lovely day to day things. I don't need a lot. A good sandwich or a pizza, a good slice of pizza will make me happy. So knowing I'm getting dessert, these are the things I would think. Uh,
But I
Actually,
think
and my students, when I have like a great, like when I teach a good class, or I have like students who really respond well, like then yeah, that's like there's a certain satisfaction in my day when I can feel like I've done my job well. So, or
it's
helping someone, yeah.
that is beautiful, but it's actually a good question because it wasn't meant at all like in a spiritual way. It can be, anything. But it's really, to me, it's always a testimony if someone is truly alive or happy or whatever you want to call it, or have a certain amount of joy, and to me, I define it really as feeling a sense of just being connected with everything, with nature, just being there in the present, and I love what Eckhart Tolle says. He says that in order to quiet the ego, you know bec- you have to be fully present in the now, because the ego draws either on the past or on the future, and this is, to me, being fully alive. It's being present, when you get up or when you talk to someone, and that's how it connects you, with someone else, right? And that's when you can truly, you live and you feel like, wow, I'm doing something that makes me somehow alive and
Can I
gives
can
me
I ask?
energy.
May I ask you a question, Yannick? I
Yeah,
mean, I
yeah,
know
sure.
it's meant to go the other way, but it's kind of ironic that you give that answer because you brought me here to talk about tradition, and you seem to have a sense of tradition as sort of actually one of the things traditions do is obviously connect us across time. If you were really being fully present, and that's what mattered, there's something very non-traditional about that. um, the idea of being in a tradition is precisely not being present just in the moment, but being present maybe across a very wide stretch of time, thinking very far back into a past where the tradition would have started, potentially into a future where the tradition continues. Maybe that's a nice way of being alive too, not just alive now, but like in some way, one of the things you think about that traditions do is it actually allows you to live forever. That
Absolutely.
you're attaching yourself to something that lives forever.
You know what? I love that. And this is also, of course, the nuances, right? But truly alive is can be precisely thinking about like the past, right? How grateful I am to my grandfather, or whatever, and
Yeah.
how I'm now here. And to me, these are not, of course, to some extent, it could seem contradictory. And I love that you pointed this out,
Yeah.
absolutely. But that it's not, it's about, and I would borrow actually the concept of Alan J. Langer, who what mindfulness really is actively noticing new things.
Yeah.
And this is also basically what Gerd said, right? Basically seeing the noticing like the old in the new and the new in the old, or Gerd, he said something like the strange things in the common things, and the common things in the strange things, something like that, and
Right.
that's, to me, truly being alive, and that's why I think that is always, I mean, obviously we can never ever fully be present without our past, of course not, because we are constantly remember everything we know, we look at through this lens, right? And it's
Right.
like with Jewish thought, like, let's say, or with Christian or Islamic thought, right? So if you're certain types of believer, you put these glasses on in order for you to make sense of whatever you encounter, and therefore we have so different things and so different viewpoints on the same thing, right? Because we just put different glasses on, and obviously I love my glasses, right? In other words, my world really makes sense, but obviously that's very also subjective, right? No, it's wonderful. I love it. Thank you so much for pointing this out. But to me, is you are a perfect example of someone who truly is a great example, and also shows great hope for future generations, because you are truly alive. You are just content with whatever you do, right? With your daughter, with your wife, the most simple things, and I think when you reach the point where you enjoy the most simple point that makes you have the biggest impact in terms of your happiness, I think then you truly are successful. This to me is success.
Right.
That's the definition to me to success. If you're happy with just the smallest thing, with a coffee with your wife and helping her to cook,
Wait,
and
you
make
think that's
sure we meet earlier.
wait, you think that's you would call that success?
Yeah,
Interesting. Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. In terms of course, you can divine it always and say, well, your financial success or whatever. But for
Yeah.
me, this is success. This is to me success of truly what meaning and the meaning of life is
Right.
to be just content and just happy with our whatever I have, right? And you
Right.
worked obviously hard.
I think it would be, I mean, that's lovely. I think, if I worked at it, then I would be happy to call it success. In my case, like, I just think it's a whole lot of good fortune. Um, usually success to me, I mean, uh, you could think of someone who was successful in business, but who was really just lucky that things went their way, maybe even despite them, but they made their money. I think in many ways, I'm just very lucky um, in any number of fronts in my life. So, but it's very nice to think of it as success. I would have, that's why I asked. I think of it in my head as just sheer luck. But success gives me more credit than I feel I deserve. So that's very
Absolutely.
nice of you.
But I tell you one thing, there's a
Yeah.
book, maybe you read it. It's called the Luck Factor, okay? It's by Richard Wiseman. I think he's a professor in the UK. And
Yeah.
actually, luck, he did extensive research about luck and those kind of
Yeah.
things. And luck mostly actually is created, So it's all about you, putting you into the position in order to get ultimately lucky. And
Yeah.
it's most of the time it's actually hard work. Of course, you are very humble, and I love that. And you're a typical professor who
Is it?
says all the time, yeah, always giving other credits and usually letting students talking more than yourself, So that's, yeah. But
Yeah.
it speaks volume. It speaks about the person you are,
I don't know
really.
if you're interested, but in philosophy, luck is often luck. I mean, if you, and maybe I think like you can imagine the perception of luck that, in the way you would think of it as sort of like something that you actually put yourself in a good position to do. You would, say, taking advantage of opportunities or things like this. It's maybe you had to do something, and it would be looks like luck from one perspective, but really you could say it had something to do with hard work or preparation or openness or other things. But sometimes in philosophy, there's a lot that came out of a discussion of what was known as moral luck. There are other areas of luck, and there are different species of moral luck, having to do with things really like the idea is that things beyond your control. So some of those are that, like you're born to a certain level of health, to a certain level of affluence,
Absolutely.
to a certain amount of love. Like really in those ways, when I have religious ways of talking and speaking, it's in some sense feeling blessed or lucky. Um, for things that really I can take no credit for, and that's in my head pretty constitutive of who I am. That I just feel a whole lot of good fortune in my life. So,
But
yeah.
I think that's also beautiful because I think you also make the best of it, right? If you have a lot
Hopefully.
of fortune, you still have to do the right things, right? It doesn't mean that if someone has a lot of fortune that he actually also does the right thing with it, you know?
Maybe. Yeah, hopefully I do the right thing. Yeah. I think my parents would be, I mean, they love me quite a bit, so I'd have to really screw it up to, but hopefully I do at least enough of the right things to make them proud. So
Saul Goldberg, thank you so much
my
for
pleasure. Yeah.
being on the show. You're truly a gift to me and to the world, and of course, to your students.
Oh, thank you, Yannick. It was fun. It was lovely to meet you.
Saul Goldberg. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.